Welcome back everybody, my name's Nick930, and to celebrate the upcoming release of Fallout 76, I wanted to share with you the complete history of Fallout. Fallout is a post-apocalyptic role-playing series where players explore massive open-world environments, complete quests, and engage in combat encounters with often mutated and irradiated enemies. The world of Fallout is modeled after a sort of strange hybrid of old 1950s American culture and futuristic nuclear-powered science fiction, in an alternate timeline where America was destroyed by a nuclear war in 2077. The series is filled with nods to various other post-apocalyptic literature and media, while also retaining its own signature style, with reoccurring enemy types, various fictional products, and unique concepts. But despite these constants, the series has diverted substantially since its initial outing in 1997, and has gone from being a top-down, turn-based RPG adventure to a fully immersive, open-world shooter game, with many fans feeling greatly divided over the change. But regardless of how you feel about the direction the series has taken, Fallout has still managed to reach the upper echelons of the gaming industry, and new titles have become somewhat of an event among the gaming community. So how did the series reach this level of pop culture fandom it sees itself in now? Well, to answer that, we're going to start by taking a look at the original game from 1997 called Fallout. Around the mid-90s, Interplay Entertainment contracted the small studio Black Isle to begin work on a spiritual successor to the 1988 post-apocalyptic classic Wasteland. The game was eventually renamed into Fallout after some copyright concerns, but would share a lot of the same basic concepts, including the setting and basic premise. Something that surprised me when researching the origins of the Fallout franchise was how fundamental the game's role-playing progression system was to its identity, and how its development has greatly influenced its current design. The original Fallout game was initially pitched as a role-playing adventure that made use of the tabletop role-playing system called GURPS, which allowed players to manually assign ability points to their various attributes, rather than being completely random like a traditional Dungeons & Dragons character creation. These old-school role-playing designs are key to the creation of the Fallout universe, and still make up the foundation of the series to this day. However, because of Fallout's mature content, Interplay was forced to abandon the GURPS system, and instead created the iconic Special system instead. Development on Fallout took several years, with the producer Tim Kaine building most of the game engine alone. After hiring roughly 30 more workers to work on advanced animations and texture designs, the project was finally completed 3 years later, and would be released for various computer platforms in fall 1997. The original Fallout takes place in Southern California, 84 years after the Great Nuclear War results in entire major cities reduced to rubble. Players take control of the Vault Dweller, a member of one of many underground vaults that were seemingly created prior to the war to provide shelter from a potential nuclear apocalypse. In truth, these vaults were never designed to withstand a true nuclear apocalypse, and were often intended for unethical experimentations on unsuspecting residents. Thankfully for our protagonist, Vault 13 was one of the control variables, and therefore operated exactly as advertised. Only at the start of this game, a computer chip designed to maintain the health of the vault's water supply fails, and the overseer of Vault 13 tasks the player with setting out from the vault to find a replacement. This is where the game truly begins, and players are given free reign of a relatively massive open-world environment, filled with dangerous mutated creatures, survivor settlements, and interesting militaristic factions. The original Fallout was a very different game than the more recent entries, with an isometric camera and a heavy emphasis on turn-based gameplay. Players would need to click on the screen to tell the characters where to go, and getting noticed by an enemy resulted in a combat encounter. Combat encounters were heavily turn-based and revolved heavily around the action points counter in the player's heads-up display. Each action required a different amount of action points to initiate before the player's turn was completed, giving the experience a very tabletop feel. Players could also recruit allies throughout the world to assist them in combat encounters, and could be partially controlled by speaking with them directly. The game's communication system functions similarly to more modern Fallout games, with players capable of talking to most NPCs and choosing between various dialogue choices. But unlike newer games, the dialogue choices were much lengthier and in-depth, and often were critical in progressing through the game. Combat was not an easy task, and with limited ammunition and often large numbers of enemies, the best option was almost always a silver tongue. Fallout's visual design obviously hasn't held up very well today. though it's interesting to learn how they managed to pull off the animations of some of the game's characters during dialogue segments. According to an article in Next Generation magazine, the art designers behind Fallout created clay molds of various character heads, and then used various programs like Vertisketch to render the models. The main game world was created on a hexagonal grid with various false 3D projections to give the illusion of depth, but outside of that, most of the effort was focused on the game's complex branching story pathing and dialogue. It was an ambitious concept, and very few developers had managed to successfully pull off this level of role-playing adventure in a video game. But as the industry grew, these basic principles would become increasingly more mainstream. Based on the aggregated score from Metacritic, Fallout was met with mostly positive reviews, with many critics applauding the creative style and approach, and many outlets declaring it the best RPG video game in years. Thanks to the success of Fallout, a sequel would release only a year later. Fallout 2 in many ways was much like the first game, with an isometric, turn-based gameplay style, and the same basic premise. But the world of Fallout 2 was denser, and featured more character behind its locations, with things like billboards, funny dialogue, and plenty of pop culture references, bringing it more in line with what fans would expect from more recent titles. According to an article by Ed Smith of PC Games Network, work for Fallout 2 had begun before the original game had even released, and with the somewhat less than stellar sales of the original game when compared to Baldur's Gate, Black Isles was under significant pressure with Fallout 2, requiring long hours and expedited work effort. A lot of the silly Easter eggs and pop culture references thrown into Fallout 2 were done because of the severe lack of time. Major portions of the game world were thrown together without any content, and designers had to go back and fill in the blanks with anything they could think of on the fly, resulting in some incredibly bizarre Easter eggs. This aesthetic ended up becoming a recurring theme associated with Fallout that would go on to define the series, with its mature content being occasionally undermined by silly prop placement. Fallout 2's story takes place 80 years after the events of the first game, with players taking control of the original Vault Dweller's descendant called the Chosen One. After a massive drought, the player is tasked with venturing out into the wasteland to locate a device called the Gek, a device that could create a thriving community out of nothing. And much like the original game, the story becomes more complex as the player explores more of the world, and various interweaving character story arcs can greatly affect the overall story outcome based on the player's choices. The main antagonists of this game are the Enclave, which are a group of descendants from the original United States government that aim to take control of the region by force in hopes that they'll be able to restore order to the country. It's an interesting plotline much like the first game, and many of the new creatures, factions, and the absurd narrative would inspire future Fallout titles. The gameplay and visuals only received minor changes, with the developers saying that they wanted to focus on the game's narrative more than anything else. There were some nice changes to help round out the experience more. Player companions, for example, would now level up alongside you, with their own evolving storyline and combat capabilities. The game's antagonists were no longer hidden behind a curtain much like the Master was in the original game, and this gave players a better understanding of who they were up against. Other changes included minor improvements to collision, and of course a more light-hearted artistic direction, with designers cramming in tons of fun Easter eggs around every corner. This resulted in one of the most popular classic Fallout experiences, with critics once again praising the game's focus on narrative role-playing action. Though a few journalists took note of some common bugs and technical problems, likely caused by the rushed development schedule. Either way, Fallout 2 was another instant hit, and the franchise would begin to change drastically as the series entered the new millennium. In the year 2000, Interplay's 14 Degrees East division had begun work on a tactical shooter game that could be played in either first or third-person perspectives within the Fallout universe. The game was called Fallout Extreme, and was set to release on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox consoles. Unfortunately, the game never left the planning stages, and was ultimately cancelled partway through the year. In Fallout Extreme, players would control a squad of soldiers called Revolutionaries, and would engage in combat with an aggressive Brotherhood of Steel in northwestern America. The game was likely going to be a series of linear missions with a very Ghost Recon-esque style to it, that would have players fighting across Oregon, Seattle, and even crossing the Bering Strait into China to foil a plot that would destroy the remains of America. Despite the game's cancellation, a lot of the basic concepts introduced in Extreme, like the heavier emphasis on combat, would find their ways into future Interplay Fallout titles, and the series would continue in what many believe was the wrong direction. In 2001, an Australian development company called Microforte introduced a game demo to Interplay using their Phoenix game engine. Interplay wasn't necessarily interested in the pitched game, but did see potential in the engine it was built on, and assigned their 14 Degree East division to work on a unique spin-off title for the Fallout franchise called Fallout Tactics: Brotherhood of Steel. Fallout Tactics is often not considered to be part of the main Fallout canon, as it often contradicts things introduced in the main series storyline. In Fallout Tactics, players start as an initiate in the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel had a falling out between members, with some wanting to focus on bolstering their strength and recruiting survivors, while others wanted to remain isolationist and focus on reclaiming pre-war technology. This resulted in a large schism between the group, with the progressive members of the Brotherhood heading east to hunt down the remaining supermutants and build a stronger community. Unlike past Fallout games, Tactics isn't an open-world adventure game, but more a squad-based real-time strategy, with players needing to move individual members of their squad around an isometric linear level and defeat enemies. Player choice wasn't nearly as important as a typical Fallout game, and the overall vibe of the game felt completely displaced from what audiences expected from the franchise. Visually, the game looked better than ever thanks to the new Phoenix engine, which allowed for sharper textures and cleaner character animations, but the game was still grounded in the same hexagonal, isometric artistic style that the series had begun with. Surprisingly, Fallout Tactics performed well according to critics. The game received scores in the mid-80% range, with most applauding the improved combat mechanics, but many were disappointed to see the open-world aspect of Fallout removed from this entry, and overall, Tactics did not sell as well as Interplay had hoped. Soon after Tactics had released, Interplay had Microforte begin work on a Fallout Tactics sequel that was planned to release a year later, but because of the first Tactics game selling so poorly, the project was soon scrapped completely in 2001. And it's a shame because the setting for Tactics 2 would have been a unique one. Tactics 2 was going to take place in the southeastern part of the United States, mainly the marshlands of Florida, and would feature an entirely different biome that still hasn't really been properly explored in the Fallout franchise outside of a few later expansions. Tactics 2 would task the player with trying to shut down a malfunctioning Gek device that was continuously generating mutated plants and creatures. Players would fight off mutated gators in the swamps of Florida, while also contending with an even more aggressive Brotherhood of Steel. The game would have released on PC and would utilize the Phoenix game engine again just like the first Tactics. It was an interesting experiment, but it was clear from the poor sales that the Fallout Tactics spin-off was a dead end, and Interplay struggled to identify what to do next with the Fallout intellectual property. The Van Buren project is where Interplay and Black Isle Studios really started to run into some serious problems. Interplay wanted more games to be produced on consoles, and many of the core gameplay mechanics in the older Fallout games didn't sit right with them either. After the cancellation of Baldur's Gate 3, Black Isle Studios was transitioned over to the ongoing Fallout 3 project, nicknamed Van Buren. Many of the developers started to drop out of Black Isle Studios due to funding concerns, and the project was eventually scrapped, despite being near completion. Van Buren's story would have taken place in the southwestern United States, around the Hoover Dam area, and begun with the player having just escaped prison. Whether or not they escaped prison for false imprisonment or were legitimately criminals would be up to the player, and this choice would also affect the player's starting stats. The player would then explore a southwestern countryside, avoiding capture from prison guard robots while also interacting with the NCR and Brotherhood of Steel, whom were in a massive conflict with each other. Van Buren's gameplay would have heavily emphasized the classic turn-based control scheme of the original two games, making it a proper Fallout 3, but because of outside pressure from Interplay, Black Isle was forced to include a real-time gameplay option. Interplay also requested that the game feature full cooperative gameplay as well, only further hurting development time. The game was originally going to be made with a fully 3D engine called NDL 3D, the precursor to the Gamebryo engine, which would be used for future Fallout titles. But because of the financial difficulties, the team decided to switch over to the Jefferson engine instead. The Jefferson engine was the same engine that had been used to create Baldur's Gate 3, and unlike past titles, would feature a legitimate three-dimensional game world, despite the locked isometric camera design. Van Buren is often referred to as the Lost Fallout game, mainly because it would have been the closest thing to a true sequel to Fallout 2. But because of Interplay's focus on the console division, the Van Buren project would need to be shut down, and Fallout 3 would take on an entirely different form years later. While Black Isle Studios was working on the doomed Van Buren project, the core Interplay team worked on the first official console debut for the Fallout series called Fallout: Brotherhood of Steel. This would be the final title in the franchise released by Interplay Entertainment. In Brotherhood of Steel, players control a squad of Brotherhood initiates as they search for a group of missing paladins, and have run-ins with various classic Fallout factions including raiders, ghouls, and super mutants. The story also had a bit of a throwback to the original game, with the player meeting up with the original Vault Dweller. Much like Fallout Tactics, this console-exclusive Fallout title would not feature an open-world environment, but instead would offer multiple missions at various locations with a linear structure. Players could not customize their stats like other Fallout games, but could choose from one of 6 playable characters, and could even play cooperatively with a friend. The game had a rotatable camera and some awkward top-down controls that hurt its audience's appeal greatly, and it feels far removed from other Fallout titles in the franchise, with a significantly heavier emphasis on action rather than on role-playing. Fallout Brotherhood of Steel failed to meet expectations and was critically panned for its repetitive mission structure and massive displacement from the franchise's core aesthetics. Before Brotherhood of Steel released, Interplay already had begun work on a sequel. Brotherhood of Steel 2 would feature pretty much the exact same gameplay mechanics, but with a few new features like a few new enemies, weapons, and playable characters. There were also plans to implement a stealth element to the gameplay, which would add a little bit more variety to the experience. However, Brotherhood of Steel 2 would never see the light of day due to poor reception for the original game, and the project was canned despite being close to completion. Throughout the mid-2000s, Interplay and Masthead Studios had begun working on an ambitious online Fallout experience simply called Fallout Online. In 2007, Bethesda Softworks purchased the Fallout intellectual property, and gave Interplay Entertainment a strict requirement regarding the development of Fallout Online. Interplay failed to meet these requirements by the deadline, and a massive legal dispute erupted, with Bethesda and Interplay going back and forth, fighting for control of the Fallout franchise. The result of this legal dispute was the cancellation of Fallout Online, and Interplay losing the rights to the Fallout MMO property. Interplay could still earn revenue from the original 3 Fallout PC titles, but the franchise would finally come under full control of Bethesda Softworks, a move that would change the franchise forever. In 2004, Bethesda Softworks, creators of the popular Elder Scrolls video games, licensed the rights from Interplay Entertainment to work on the Fallout franchise. Using the Gamebryo engine, the same engine used for the award-winning Elder Scrolls Oblivion game, Bethesda Softworks created a massive 3D environment beyond the scope of anything seen in a Fallout game prior, while also respectfully maintaining the core aesthetic of the original titles. The result was Fallout 3, a game that turned the Fallout franchise into a mainstream phenomenon. Fallout 3's story takes place in the Capital Wasteland, the post-apocalyptic ruins of the Washington, D.C. area. Players take control of the Wanderer, starting literally with the character's birth. After a lengthy introduction that explains what life inside a vault would be like, the player is forced to escape out into the nuclear fallout of the wasteland to search for their father. It's at this point that the game really begins, with players given free reign of the world and being able to explore at their own discretion. Players eventually would find survivor communities like Megaton or Rivet City and complete various quests while also looking for clues to locate their father. Popular Fallout factions like the Enclave and Brotherhood can be found in the world, with the Enclave being the main antagonists and the Brotherhood focusing more on being the saviors of the people rather than their original focus of securing high-end technology. Fallout 3 was a genuine Fallout experience, with a heavy emphasis on exploration and player choices, but the gameplay is where it deviates heavily from the older titles. Taking full advantage of the more advanced game engine, Fallout 3 was a full 3D world that could be explored in either third or first person, a major departure from the original game's isometric approach. The movement design was also changed substantially. Fallout 3 featured a much more conventional control scheme, with players able to walk, jump, and fire weapons freely. Combat would no longer be modeled after the classic turn-based design, but would instead happen in real time, with players needing to rely on accuracy and cover. However, realizing how fundamental the classic turn-based design was to the Fallout aesthetic, Bethesda incorporated a unique mechanic called VATS, which allowed players to stop time and target specific enemies and limbs. The accuracy would be adjusted based on the weapon, stats, and distance, with each shot consuming a certain amount of action points, just like the old games. Fallout 3 also saw the return of the Pip-Boy, a device that previously served simply as the name for the game's user interface, only now it's become a more functional and immersive tool. Players could bring up the Pip-Boy to look at the game world map, browse their inventory, check on their health status, and view quest information. But now it could also be used to tune into radio stations, and featured a bright flashlight to explore dark locations like the DC Metro. Fallout 3 was incredibly ambitious, and a massive experience that redefined the Fallout franchise while also retaining the fundamental components that made the series special to begin with. Its combination of role-playing elements with a more action-oriented approach was well received by audiences, and introduced a new generation of gamers to the Fallout universe. The mature, brutal character of Fallout's world remained mostly intact, while also retaining the fun charm and personality of Fallout 2 to some degree. Fallout 3 was met with exceptionally high review scores, with many praising the game's huge expansive world. though a few did find fault in the game's awkward real-time combat controls, which admittedly haven't aged very well. Regardless, Fallout 3 was a huge success, and Bethesda proved capable enough to take on the Fallout intellectual property. Fallout New Vegas is essentially the swan song of Interplay Entertainment. After the colossal financial failures of Black Isle Studios in the early 2000s, some of the original designers left the studio and created their own independent studio called Obsidian Entertainment. After the success of Fallout 3, Bethesda Softworks contracted Obsidian to create a new Fallout game, while the core Bethesda team focused their efforts on development for a new Elder Scrolls experience. This provided the perfect opportunity for the ex-Fallout creators to finally utilize old ideas from past cancelled Fallout titles like Van Buren, while also taking advantage of the Gamebryo engine and previously existing game assets to build their dream Fallout experience. New Vegas has one of the more unique stories in the franchise, with the player taking control of the Courier after recovering from a critical bullet wound to the head and needing to hunt down the man responsible. New Vegas takes place in the Mojave Desert and features many classic factions from older Fallout games, including the NCR, Brotherhood of Steel, Caesar's Legion, and even the Khans. Unlike Fallout 3, New Vegas has a much more open-ended narrative, with no truly good ending. The game's critical narrative choices weren't as black and white, and the interconnected story paths made the game significantly more replayable. New Vegas' gameplay is mostly the same as Fallout 3, with identical controls and movement. New Vegas did feature a few new things, like the ability to aim down the sights of a firearm and ability to craft ammunition. New Vegas built on what Bethesda managed to establish with Fallout 3, and delivered a more classic Fallout style. Unfortunately, New Vegas is also infamous for its unstable build quality, with countless glitches, game crashes, and save corruptions ruining the experience in its early days. The game is now in a far more playable state, and loyal community members have created workarounds to the more common problems. New Vegas was received very well, but not as well as Fallout 3 by reviewers. It has since inherited a loyal fan following, with many claiming that New Vegas was the last great Fallout game, and it's understandable why people think this way. New Vegas not only featured the same great open-ended gameplay of Fallout 3, but also reintroduced the lighthearted and significantly more interesting aesthetics from the classic games. Even the game's expansion packs were well crafted, and remain a benchmark for high-quality video game downloadable content. Despite both Fallout 3 and New Vegas collectively receiving high critical acclaim, the series went silent and wouldn't re-emerge until the next console generation. After years of silence and heavy fan speculation at the slightest mention of any Fallout-related hints on the internet, Bethesda finally took to the E3 stage to announce the latest major installment to the Fallout franchise. However, before we talk about that, I wanted to briefly mention Fallout Shelter, a mobile spin-off title that had players controlling an underground vault and maintaining a community of survivors. It was later re-released for PC and console platforms and was received well, and would ultimately serve as a game to hold fans over until the release of Fallout 4. Soon after development for Fallout 3 wrapped up, the Bethesda team began work on a new in-house game engine called the Creation Engine. This engine would not only be used to build the massively popular Skyrim in 2011, but would also be used to build 2015's Fallout 4. Fallout 4 was beyond ambitious, with revamped visuals, a denser open world to explore, and a ton of new gameplay features to fully immerse the player in the world of Fallout. However, this focus on improving the gameplay inadvertently lowered the quality of the game's narrative. In Fallout 4, players would assume the role of the Lone Wanderer, who manages to survive the Great War by being cryogenically frozen inside Vault 111. After witnessing the kidnapping of his or her son, the Lone Wanderer wakes up and sets out on a mission to track the kidnappers down. But as always with Fallout, the main storyline takes a backseat as the player freely explores the open world and completes quests while also adoring their pet dog with teddy bears. Many fans did note that Fallout 4's story didn't match the level of complexity of past Fallout games. This was mainly due to Bethesda's decision to fully voice cast the player's character, aka the Lone Wanderer. To realistically record all the different lines of dialogue convincingly, Bethesda narrowed the scope of the game's role-playing significantly, and limited dialogue to 4 simple choices, often being either yes, no, maybe, or something silly. And regardless of your dialogue choice, the story seemed to almost always play out the same way. Previous titles allowed you to build a truly evil character if you wanted, and the story seemed to organically allow you to do that. But Fallout 4 often pointed players towards the good guy storyline. There's still a fair bit of role-playing to be had and plenty of branching paths and story arcs, but it didn't reach the level of storytelling on offer in games like New Vegas. Fallout 4 did receive some excellent quality of life improvements to the gameplay. Firstly, the shooting mechanics were made to feel much more fluid and consistent. Weapon firing animations had more impact to them, and sound effects were bumped up a notch. There was a massive arsenal of unique weapons to choose from, all of which could be fully customized at weapon benches. This level of customization extended to creating food, medicine, armor, and even heavy power armor. The power armor went from being just a simple clothing item to an essential tool that players could climb in and out of at will and customize with bullet-resistant plating, targeting sensors, and jetpacks. Enemies were more varied than ever, with a ton of different factions, creatures, and legendary enemies that were often more difficult to defeat and rewarded players with special legendary items. Friendly companions were made to be more practical, with each companion offering different benefits to the player, and they also could be directly controlled with basic commands. If you didn't feel like completing quests, you could spend hours creating custom-friendly settlements, complete with storefronts and defenses to hold off against constantly reoccurring enemy attacks. Visually, Fallout 4 was miles ahead of its predecessors, with smoother animation work, beautiful volumetric lighting effects, and a level of environmental detail unmatched by other titles in the series. The game had a few performance-based issues in addition to some reoccurring bugs regarding the settlement feature, but it was still a surprisingly solid game despite Bethesda's reputation for releasing broken products. Fallout 4 was an experience unlike any other Fallout game on the surface, but after hours spent exploring its hugely dense world, players were greeted to a ton of repetitive tasks, like going to certain locations and killing a randomly generated group of enemies. This, on top of the reduced role-playing aspects and a controversy regarding Bethesda's paid modification storefront scandal, resulted in a lukewarm user reception, but the game's critical score was still mostly positive. In 2018, Bethesda once again took to the E3 show floor to provide details on their recently revealed new entry to the series, Fallout 76. Fallout 76 would utilize the same creation engine used to build Fallout 4, but instead of providing another heavily narrative-driven single-player experience, would be a multiplayer-focused open-world adventure. According to Todd Howard, Fallout 76 will not feature any human NPCs to speak to, but instead will offer players quests through other means like finding nodes, reading computer terminals, or just encountering events. The idea behind Fallout 76 was to create a world where players would be able to take on the roles of human NPCs, and could theoretically create storefronts on their own to barter with other players. This has already worried some players, unsurprisingly, as one of Fallout's strongest aspects has always been its engaging narrative experience. But the prospect of being able to finally explore the wasteland with friends is an interesting one, and I'm curious how Bethesda's anti-griefing design will play out, especially on the PC platform. From what's been shown so far, Fallout 76 will handle exactly like Fallout 4 in terms of controls and combat mechanics, only enemies will likely be scaled to be more difficult to account for the inclusion of multiplayer. A lot of the focus of Fallout 76 seems to be on exploring the open world and defeating legendary enemies for valuable loot, so if you are really into Fallout 4's endgame content, then Fallout 76 should be a no-brainer. Unique to Fallout 76 are nuclear launch codes, which, when combined, can grant players access to a nuclear warhead, which can then be fired anywhere around the West Virginia countryside. Doing so will not only destroy anything with a heartbeat in that area, but also create a high-level zone with legendary enemy spawns being more frequent. It's a clever idea that plays perfectly into the Fallout mythos, and may be the most popular endgame activity plan so far. Fallout 76 will be coming to the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC platforms November 14th, and I'll be sure to cover that game when I get my hands on it, including a full review and direct visual comparison to Fallout 4. Fallout's legacy is one that's unmatched when it comes to the action role-playing genre. The post-apocalyptic world of Fallout is one that's dreary and depressing, yet inviting at the same time, often challenging players with the question, how would you survive a nuclear Armageddon? It's a fun look at an alternate science fiction timeline that provides a deep and generally consistent lore, while also enticing players with its addictive, explorative nature. And the fact that its visuals are never really up to par with the competition is a testament to how much more important a solid story and fun gameplay experience are to creating a good game. While the series has taken a few more steps in the direction of being an action-adventure game, often abandoning its hardcore RPG roots, the series is still more popular than ever, and retains that charm that Interplay and Black Isle first brought to the table back in 1997. I hope you guys enjoyed this retrospective look at the Fallout franchise. Which games were your favorite? Let us know in the comment section, and if you want to see more retrospective pieces like this in the future, please consider being a member of my Patreon, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.